Building anything really is, once you decide to start to do it, it's just a series of problem solving exercises. Look at the most complex problems, putting a man on the moon, going into space, building the most advanced interstellar telescope. These enterprises have run into a whole host of different challenges that are driven by a host of complex problems, and having the right set of systems for addressing those problems is really important.
Hello, welcome to the Big Strategy Podcast. I'm your host and fellow strategist, Jeff Hyatt. This is your go-to spot for real talk with the masterminds of business strategy. It's about sharing stories, insights, and those little nuggets of wisdom to help you unlock big growth. Let's turn the key and spring into action. Welcome to this episode of the Big Strategy Podcast. Today, I'm honored to be joined by John Belizaire, the CEO of Soluna Holdings. And John and I are kindred spirits in the sense that we're huge renewable energy advocates and also advocates for behind-the-meter renewable energy. But don't worry if that doesn't roll off your tongue. We'll have plenty of time to go over that in today's episode. So, John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. I'm very happy to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, John, I always begin the podcast by asking you the hardest question first, and that is, please introduce yourself.
Happy to do so. So I'm John Belizaire, as you said, CEO of Soluna Holdings. I am a 25-year entrepreneur. I've been focused over those 22 decades or so on big waves of technology that smash into legacy industries. I started my career as a computer scientist. I'm classically trained as a computer scientist, both undergrad and graduate. Started my career at Intel, where we were focused on pushing the PC revolution as far as it could go. And a lot of our focus was trying to figure out how we could get the PC to do more. Every time we had to drop $2 billion and follow Dr. Moore's prediction that we would put more processors and transistors on these chips, we had to go build these next generation fabrication plants. And so we had to figure out a way to drive demand for them. And guess what? The way to do that is to look at software dynamics and computing and computer usage. And there was a famous speech that Andrew Grove at the time gave at a big PC conference where he basically explained that he had this insight about PCs and that today we just use them as calculators, but they could become more powerful communication platforms if we brought the PC to the communication world, like integrated those two worlds. It's the first time I was introduced to the concept of convergence. And in that dynamic, I learned a lot about innovation, looking at the future and planning for what technology would do to the world in different clips, and then sort of how to think about what happens next. I took that training and expertise to a number of different startups that I founded, primarily, as I said, in the B2B software space. We would go after big enterprises that want to use digital technology, leverage their data, improve workflow, et cetera. And most recently, I took it to the insurance industry to help them to make better insurance decisions using big data. After a short pause in the entrepreneurial environment, I didn't exactly go to a beach. Maybe I went to a poolside somewhere and took a break. I read a lot of books and try to sort of think about what's happening next. And right about that time, circa 2018, the world was really thinking about climate change more. By 2020, we were all in sort of the back of a Tesla racing into the future of sustainability. And I entered the foray by helping a friend of mine that had this problem in Northern Africa where they had a wind farm and they really had no way to monetize the energy. It was basically completely stranded. And the reason was there was no infrastructure. The country where it was based was going through a big renewable energy wave, and they needed to find a way to solve this problem. How do you get power to load? And I like mental models, and one of my favorite ones is the whole concept of inversion. The problem is, how do you get power to load? What if you reverse the question and say, how do you get load to power? Well, you have to rethink load. You have to think of load that can be moved and that's more mobile. And that sort of clicked the insight that maybe we should focus more on bringing load to stranded energy And then we started thinking what type of load could do that. One, two, three, we ended up in the computing space. And that became the foundational insight for Soluna. And since then, we've gone on a pretty significant journey. So I guess who is John Belizaire? A guy who is crazy enough to go after solving some really hard problems and building companies around them.
So you talk about inversion as a mental model. I'm a huge fan of mental models myself, and I would actually go back to the Intel example and the idea of inverting the hardware question to a software solution. And if you can increase demand on that supply of computing power, you'll ultimately lift the need for excess computing power. And that seems to be a red thread that has woven through your career, whether it was that or now at Salona, for example. Tell us a little bit about the value of understanding these mental models, and if you have others that are favorites, but just this idea of basing that decision on a fundamental principle.
Yeah, I didn't realize I was doing that until I started studying mental models. But a lot of problem solving is really about walking around the problem and seeing what different angles you can use to address it. And so you're right, there are a lot of common threads around my approach to entrepreneurship. It's really about rethinking a problem and thinking about how you can leverage either existing technologies or inventing new technology to go after it. But first, you have to step away from the problem altogether and not think about the technology at all and just think about where the pressure points are, what are the different ways to address it, and sort of interrogate the problem in an expansive way as possible. I'm a big believer in lateral thinking. So essentially taking a problem and rather than taking a sort of vertically oriented logical approach, kind of go illogical about it. At Saluna, we have this exercise we do pretty consistently these days called the 10 ideas exercise. So we will take a problem, whatever that problem may be. It's usually a big one that just kind of hit us out of nowhere. And we will get a team of folks together and basically exercise our idea muscle. We will try to come up with 10 ways to address the issue, address the problem. And if we can't come up with 10, we'll do 20. If we can't do 20, we'll do 30. The whole idea is like no idea is dumb. Come up with as many ideas as possible. And invariably, one of those ideas we throw against the wall ultimately becomes the solution that we go with. And most of the time, it's something we didn't even think about. We didn't think was even in the cards, but it's the one that makes you go, huh, what about that? There are a number of mental models that I like using. I write a blog called CEO Playbook. You can go to CEOPLAYBOOK.co, and there you'll find a whole series of essays that I've written over the years. They're really consolidations of learnings. I turned it into a book last summer because I'm crazy like that. And there you'll find all sorts of micro insights that I have learned over the years through problem solving, through building companies, through running into all sorts of challenges and experiencing pain. And so what I try to do at our company is teach the team to exercise those idea muscles as much as possible, embrace the concept of mental models, because 99% of the time, if there's a problem you're solving, there's probably a problem in another industry, an adjacent problem that's very similar that you can use to solve the problem that you're facing. And then I try to create as collaborative a culture as possible. And that is because no one person is smart enough to solve every problem, right? You get different perspectives, different cultural backgrounds, different experiences that people have been through that can lend them to put that one idea in those 10 ideas that just changes everything. That's the whole approach that we take.
I teach design thinking, and we always talk about diverge before you converge. Simply said, let's ensure we're answering the right question before we come up with a solution. And you talked about having a diversity of experiences around the table. Sometimes people ask about diversity in the design field because I think the IDEO model or the traditional consultant model can skew male, can skew white. But if you think about it, if you focus on bringing people with diverse experiences around the table to the table, give them the space to have that creative freedom. And as a leader, what I hear you doing that I find to be particularly successful is you're laying that insight, you're laying that fundamental ground truth right? You're not letting them just go free. You're saying, this is the insight, this is the model, this is the framework, this is what we believe in. Design at the extremes, we'll test at the mean with your ideation, but understand it needs to come from this truth. If you want to debate the truth, that's fine. But once we agree on that truth, we got to go.
Yeah, I can resonate with that. I've never heard it put so eloquently. I think it is a process and it has proven very effective for us. Building a company, building anything really is once you decide to start to do it, it's just a series of problem solving exercises. Look at the most complex problems, putting a man on the moon and going into space, building the most advanced interstellar telescope. These enterprises have run into a whole host of different challenges that are driven by a host of complex problems, and having the right set of systems for addressing those problems is really important. Another thing that's important is as leaders, we don't have to solve all the problems. I think that sometimes we delude ourselves to believe that we have to sort of hit every nail into the plank of wood to sort of finish the job. You don't have to solve every problem, just the most important ones that are going to move you forward. The rest tend to sort of work themselves out, interestingly enough. And you also need to learn how to classify the problems so that you can determine how important the decisions you're about to make around those problems are. The more complex, more irreversible those decisions, borrowing from Mr. Bezos, they should be slowed down and thought through more. And that's where mental models can help. And if they're simple, easy decisions, just choose one. There's probably three or four ways to go. Choose one. And if it's wrong, just choose another one.
That gets back to the mental model of optionality. What's the opportunity cost, right? If you go back and read Munger, he talks about the opportunity cost. And Shane Parrish, who's a first principle thinker kind of this generation, he says, how easy is it to go back through that door? And if it's easy to go back through that door, that's your job.
Also, different voices have different weights, not just from a cultural perspective, but a domain expertise perspective. The person closest to the problem should weigh in more because they're really talking from the right place, if you will. But the best ideas don't have to come from those people.
Since this is a strategy podcast, John, I want to ask you about the truism that many people subscribe to, and I want your opinion that culture eats strategy for breakfast. True or false?
Yes, it does. I, for many years, did not want to believe that because I felt like people who are classically trained on strategy anybody can do strategy, right? You just pick up a book and follow the recipe. I am a big believer in this. Every person is made up of a collection of DNA, and the mixture of that DNA, the combination of their two parents and then the entire line from there, creates this unique individual that has certain superpowers to some extent in certain areas versus others. And then anything that they do, any kind of training is basically going to enhance those inherent superpowers and allow them to do superhuman things. Companies are very much like that. The way you build the team, in our company, we are an elegant combination of energy experts, software people, hardware and mechanical people with a host of different backgrounds. And then we have business people who have customer facing expertise, et cetera. And we have financial services expertise, private equity. You blend all of that together in that unique way, it does give us an advantage. There are certain superpowers that we have as a company that is different than the company down the street. Now you combine that with very methodical operating systems and strategy frameworks and design thinking, mental models, all of that kind of stuff. You inject that into that DNA, and guess what? You have a powerful capability for execution. I can't tell you how many problems we've been able to solve incredibly well because we have this mixture of DNA and the ability to be thoughtful about every decision we make. So culture has a lot to do with that, and how you design that culture and be really thoughtful about creating that really does go a long way to shape the success of your company going forward.
John, let's take this opportunity to narrow the lens a little bit, specifically onto Soluna. How do you look at Soluna? Are you broad across the market? Are you deep on a single application, or are you trying to be this hybrid T-shaped model? What is Salona? What does it do? And what's your strategy?
Well, let's start with what we do and what problems we solve. The best companies are focused on solving really hard problems and making it look really easy. The fact that you can order a package from Amazon for just about anything, and the next day it's in front of my front door. That looks like it was really easy, but that is incredibly hard to do consistently. We're in the business of making renewable energy a global superpower. It has become clear to us, whether regardless of your background or political affiliations, that we do have a climate problem. One of the solutions to that problem is we should have more green electrons flowing on our global grids. And in many parts of the world, actually, we need power generation altogether. When I was in Africa, one of the insights I had was that many of these countries have incredible resources that could help the planet, but there is no real infrastructure capability to bring in capital to support the development of that. And as a result, billions of people are in the dark. Literally, you fly over the continent and there are parts of it that are just dark. Whereas if you fly over the US, there's glistening lights all over the place. And that's because there's energy poverty there. So finding a way to build out green electrons at scale very quickly is going to be a key tool for us to hit our climate goals. So, how are we helping to do that? Do we build the power plants? No. Do we help to finance them? No. Actually, what we do is we find the power plants that have been built or are about to be built by the big financiers. And by the way, since the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, the global investment in renewables has exploded. There is so much capital going after investment in sustainability technologies and renewable energy. So there's going to be a lot of it built. And the cost of building it has come down significantly. It is now the cheapest way to build power plants is to do it in a renewable fashion. So wind and solar are the cheapest forms. They outpace fossil fuels by a wide margin. And their growth, if you look at the amount of renewables that's being put up, it's huge compared to the other sources. But there's a little secret problem that people don't know about. And that is that 30 to 40% of the power that gets built once the plant is up and spinning gets wasted. Think about that for a second. Almost half, a third to 40%, almost half of the power that gets built out for these more sustainably driven power plants never make it to the grid. The reason is because the grid was not designed for asynchronous energy generation. It was designed for synchronous energy generation. There's some great books out there that sort of talk about this. One of them is called The Grid by Gretchen. I forget her last name, but it's a fantastic book. It takes you through the whole history of how power plants and the whole regulatory framework got set up. And the simple idea was that these folks built out power plants and then they would plan how big the power plant was across the demand for their customers, and they could project that out. And there was an excellent synchrony between those two elements. Now, when you look at the existing grid and you replace those synchronous power plants with asynchronous ones that can be controlled and dispatched by Mother Nature rather than the grid, sometimes you're going to have more energy and sometimes you're going to have less or not enough energy. So that balance is becoming a major imbalance in the grid. So how do you solve that problem where you have power that's wasted in a distributed basis across the grid, and the sum of that amounts to hundreds of terawatt hours every year? How do you solve that? It turns out there are two common solutions that people think about when you're thinking vertically. One is, what? John, can't you just store the energy? Yeah, you can store it. But do you know how big a battery you would have to build and how long you would have to store it for? Because it's not like the battery is also a business and it has to make money by through arbitrage, right? So when the prices are low, it stores the energy. When the prices are high, it wants to export the energy. Well, it becomes part of the problem.
Earlier this season, we had Vic Shao on, who was the CEO of Green Charge Networks, that was battery storage, right? And so he went deep into those economics. And you're right, it's not as simple as storing it. And even if you do store it, there's still a loss.
Exactly. There's still a loss somewhere. It's either in the battery side or in the power side. And so you have new problems that you have to address. The other is I hear, why don't you just move it? Why don't you just send the power past where, it is and send it to, if it's in Oklahoma, send it to Atlanta where everybody's partying right now. Well, the problem is there aren't enough of those lines. They're not big enough, and they can take decades upon decades to build because we don't live in an environment where you can just stand up infrastructure and you don't care about what it does to people's land and the environment. So you have to do a lot of planning. And so they're just not fast enough to solve the problem.
Can I ask a provocative question around that?
Yeah, sure.
Is China better at this than we are? Are they more important to changing the future of our climate than the United States?
Well, I can tell you that they are standing up more renewable, nuclear, and you name it technology over there at a higher pace than we are here. And they can get power lines up faster than any place in the world. The reason is because, for lack of a better word, it's basically a military state. So they can do whatever they want. They say, look, we're going to build a new railway between this point and that point. And if your house is in the way, look, we got to move your house. You got to move. There's nothing you can say. You can't petition and require them to run a couple of studies or whatever. So, yes, if we didn't have those constraints, then we could use those other options, usually for sure transmission. If the capital was there, it can be done, but we don't have that. And so that doesn't help our grid, unfortunately. So we have to think laterally. We have to think differently about the problem. So you have wasted energy. It's not concentrated in one location, it's distributed in nature. The load centers are fixed. You can't take a city, put it on a bus, and move it to where the power is.
And the next city or the next development being built isn't being done with
right, or the next city, and it just propagates. Right, it's a distributed problem, and so you have to think about it differently. So what is fundamentally the problem? The problem is that you have energy that's stranded in a number of particular locations, and you need to bring load to that location. That's fundamentally the problem. The only way to monetize the problem is to so you can start convincing people to move to West Texas. I doubt that's going to work unless they're into farming and renewable energy. So the insight that we had was, what if you could bring load that was essentially portable in nature and actually distributed in nature? What type of load looks like that? In the past, what you would have is manufacturing or process centers, very energy intensive process centers. Aluminum smelting was the mode in the past. So you would have these big centers right next to a big hydro plant. You have a massive aluminum smelter. I've been up to a couple of those in Canada and New York. Well, I just talked about climate change. We don't go in for that, putting these dirty plants up. So it turns out that we already do something every day that uses a tremendous amount of energy. Actually, today, almost 2% of the global footprint. It's already a distributed thing. That's computing. We carry massive computers in our pockets every day, and they use resources that can be anywhere, and they're spread out all over the place. The insight that Soluna had in the framework that we use was to invert the problem, as I said earlier, and the concept of convergence. So earlier I talked about, hey, PCs can do more than just being calculators. What if we integrate telecommunications into the PC? We can now make it do more than that. It can become a powerful communication device and probably reshape the world. Andy was right. Everything we do now is a connected PC, right? We talk on our phones. We're enjoying this podcast in a distributed fashion. It allowed the world to not stay frozen for too long during a pandemic because we could reconnect and do business in a distributed fashion. That came from essentially saying, hey, PCs need to do more. Telecommunication, which was going through a big deregulation. What else can we do with these lines, these communication lines? And you merge them together. You basically smush them together, right? And integrated them. And right there in the middle is the innovation, right? You created the connected PC. Well, there's an opportunity here where if you take renewable energy, which has this big wasted energy problem, and you combine it with AI, whose potential is massive right now, right? I said we do a lot of computing. Well, looks like we're going to be doing a lot more computing, leveraging our data, and that's going to use 10 times the amount of power that it uses today. 10 times. That means that just looking at the amount of energy that we use today on a global basis will explode. Granted, we'll have efficiencies and all of that. If you take the current ChatGPT and these models, every time they do an upgrade, the amount of energy it uses or needs explodes. So to reach its potential, AI really needs massive amounts of sustainable energy. And so you smush those two things together, and right there in the middle, you have an innovation we call renewable computing. And that's what we're doing at Soluna. We are creating the first infrastructure company that goes around and finds these sources of unused power and converts them into global computing resources. That's the simple thing we do, turned wasted energy into computing. There's a whole bunch of hard things that you have to do that simple thing. So I'd say we're more of a deeply focused company on being a strong infrastructure company than being sort of a wide, thin provider or developer where we sort of find the power and good luck, do whatever you want with it.
I mean, a lot of your value is the connective tissue between these historically disconnected assets and unlocking the value.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. We do drop a lot of money building these data centers. That's the key infrastructure we do, but we don't have to build the data center and the power plant because there's infinite amounts of capital to go do that. But they do have a problem. They just can't get to, we've spoken to some of the largest infrastructure companies in the world. There's lots of them. A lot of that has to do with the fact that, these large sovereign wealth funds and pension funds need to deploy their capital to generate returns to deliver to their constituencies. Infrastructure turns out to be a perfect place to put that. So there's lots of demand for that. Sustainability is driving that. But what we're finding is that they're slowing because their technology and modeling is showing that we don't actually make any money because most of our power gets wasted. And so some of the biggest and best ones have reached out to us and said, hey, we realize this. We've seen what you guys are putting out there. We want to talk to you guys because we think you can help us. We should build power plants and data centers at the same time and put them in these locations such that we can build more of them. And that's additionality. And that is something that's very exciting to us. The fact that this lateral approach to computing and renewables, this convergence could significantly change what power development actually is and what data center development is, right? They're coming together to become the same thing.
You're fighting the entrenched status quo, a carbon-based economy. And there are plenty of entities, whether it's developers, asset owners, financiers, etc., who have a business model of optimizing that local maximum. They're not looking for the global maximum. And so what is that objection, or why isn't this just common practice? Why isn't every asset owner calling you to implement this? What's the hesitancy?
The challenge with this environment is because somebody had to do it first. Somebody had to not experience any pain from doing it. It has to fit within that classic project finance structure. We've developed a structure that allows us to do this and not break all of the dynamics of the project itself, right? It's already selling power to somebody, and now we got to buy its wasted energy. How do you do that without breaking all the other sort of very well honed structures that are in there? Those are all the hard problems that have to be solved. Once that's solved and it's proven a certain number of times, its use will just accelerate. So the answer to your question is it's just a matter of time. It's not like a permanent blockage. As people are starting to get their heads around it. How does this work? We started out using Bitcoin computing as the primary monetization of the technology. If you're a Bitcoiner, it makes sense. If you're a renewable energy person, what in the world is Bitcoin? Now you got to explain that. We are now moving into AI, and they're like, how can you build an AI facility behind the meter in the western part of Texas? You have to run and sort of explain to them that it can work, and here's why. In fact, during the Bitcoin thing, we've actually proven and collected data that allows us to understand how you would do it for AI. And so it can be done. And look at the structure that actually enhances your project and doesn't introduce any more risk than you're already taking on. Oh, I didn't realize that. That's fascinating. I didn't think of that because I didn't have to. But now people are breathing down the necks of these power plant owners and saying, why aren't we getting the return on our capital at the levels that we expected? What are you going to do about that?
John, you talk about investors and their expectations of return. You're adding additional value to existing and new projects. How has interest rates affected or impacted your business?
The interest rates have increased the cost of capital. So the expectations on returns for projects has gone up, right? Your cost of capital is one thing, but then you've got to borrow money. 99% of these projects include debt. So the cost of that debt has gone up. You need other sources of revenue. And the price of power hasn't increased, right? Although there's some inflationary movements and stuff like that. But where these power plants are being built, the power dynamic is well known and is only going down. And so if your volume of energy is the same, your cost of capital has increased, guess what? Returns are going down. So how do you improve the profitability of that project and the prospects of it? Well, you have to essentially do something different, reduce the amount of curtailments that you're going to have, reduce the amount of wasted energy, monetize more of the power at different price levels. What you need to do is just enhance that project or do something different altogether. Take the capital that you would normally use to build projects and go buy projects that are not doing so well, and then re-architect the project to include these data centers. And bada bing, all of a sudden you've got, more revenues and returns that you can do. So it's causing the whole industry to sort of rethink. Actually, there's a really good quote. One of our power partners explained to us that their CEO, they used to do this modeling for these projects, and they would sort of say, look, there's this P50, P90, like 50% probability this is going to happen, 90% probability this is going to happen, right? So lower probability, higher effect on the project events that could happen, some big weather event or something like that, or the curtailment and power monetization gap that they projected certainly swings to the other side, right? And it turns out that what they're beginning to do differently is to say, we should just assume that that swing is now a P90 event. Like it's going to happen. So how do we design into the projects that we build an insurance policy against that? So that difference in thinking is going to drive more profitability for those types of companies.
What would you say have been the biggest learnings for you in this journey? And then how has that made you effective today as you're honing in on this very precise value proposition?
So one of our financiers, a company called Spring Lane Capital, puts together this developer U, they call it, basically teaching young companies who are in the sustainability development space how to go about doing it. And they held their annual one this year in San Francisco, and I was fortunate enough to participate in one of the panels. And one of the things they did is they took you through the process of what is development? What are you actually trying to do, right? And what most people think about is you're building a project, you're building a thing. And actually, that's part of what you're doing, but that's not really what you're doing. What you're really doing is you're building a company. And so it's important for folks to think about forays into any kind of big engineering or project focused endeavor that you're building a company. There's a company that solves a problem. So in our case, it's wasted energy, delivering sustainable computing. And to solve that problem, you build this innovative project. And then within the project, you have a whole host of different challenges that you have to deal with, de-risking it, financing it, perfecting technology, scaling it, those types of things. And there's a lot of learning that comes from, number one, that insight, company versus project. And number two, all of the learnings that come with the project level challenges. In our case, we've learned the importance of timing. Things take longer than you expect in the infrastructure space. I'm a software guy. Hey, you can write a code and build.
Those two timelines don't
Yeah,
always
yeah,
synchronize.
exactly. And so I've been reprogrammed to understand that big infrastructure projects take time. The second is it's all about people. You have to think about the plethora of people that are going to be involved in the success of that project, not just inside your company, but more importantly, outside your company. The landowner. What does the landowner, what do they care about? What are they concerned about? We deal with landowners that have farms that have been in their families for generations. They have wind turbines on the farms, and now we're trying to convince them to build acres of these modular data centers. And for us, things that shouldn't matter, but if you are a owner of something, what you think about matters, right? So the aesthetics of it, how much water we're going to use, all of those types of dynamics become important. The projects themselves, those projects we talk about that have these challenges, you'd think it'd be a no-brainer. Hey, we're going to buy all your power that you wasted at a fixed price, and it is a healthy price. It gets you to unlock all of these tax credits and significantly improves the profitability of the project. Should be a no-brainer. And we do a lot of work in actually presenting all of this analysis to show them. Well, it turns out that there's many constituencies that need to agree that that is a good thing, right? They've got to convince their tax equity, their cash equity, their debt. It just surprised me how many parties are involved in these projects that have to give consent or be supportive. Most of them are, but there's always invariably something going on in that project that has nothing to do with us, where somebody suddenly feels, hey, they want something from me. And now I get to solve that problem we had before and reintroduce it, things like that, which slows the process down. And of course, the regulatory side, we are connecting a data center behind the meter with a power plant that has to then connect into the grid, change the nature of the resource that the grid has modeled. There's all sorts of engineering, technical, regulatory compliance, and all sorts of things that have to be dealt with before they can say yes, even though they're happy to say yes, but they have to follow their protocols, and that takes time. And so people is a big part of it, and we've learned a lot about that.
At the Berkeley Innovation Group, we are a strategy consultancy and AI advisory firm focused on mid-market companies looking to unlock big growth. In contrast to management consultants' typical top-down, hypothesis-driven approach, Big uses a curiosity-inspired, bottom-up approach, leveraging customer insights to drive strategy co-creation. Learn more about our approach by downloading our ebook at biginnovates.com/ebook. Now, back to the show. How do you model your systems? Do you model them to a certain level of the output of the system, or do you model them that you can import carbon-produced power in a pinch? How do you model that?
The first thing is, when I say data center for our listeners and students, don't think about a giant monolithic building. We designed them in this Lego block almost fashion. So if you fly over our sites, they're more like a distributed system. So each building is its own thing, but it's integrated into the whole.
And there's a great picture on your website. You just go to the website. It's right there.
Yeah, you can go to visit some of our sites at salunacomputing.com, and you can see that big scaled site. Actually, we can control how big it actually is at any given time. It's more like a flexible living and breathing system that's controlled by some advanced software we've built. And what that allows us to do is source power from 3 different locations at any given time. We can source power from that wasted energy. So if you're driving by the renewable energy power plant and half the turbines aren't spinning, when our data center is there, they'll turn on. They'll actually be spinning now because there's a load center right there. There's a sink for that power. So we buy that power at a fixed cost. And then the second place we're able to source power from is when the plant is bigger than us, it's not being curtailed. So there's no pricing signal or signal from the grid to curtail itself. We will siphon some of that power off, if you will, because we're there. Electrons go to the first source of desire. I like that explanation in the book, The Grid. So we will eat some of that energy, and we pay the power plant the price that they would get at that location for that power. And so they're economically indifferent to us being there or not. And then the third source is when the power plant is smaller than us. So let's say it's a 20 megawatt facility, or 20 megawatt facility right now because the wind is not blowing very much. And we're a 50 megawatt facility. There's 30 megawatts of energy need that we need to satisfy. We have 2 choices. We can shrink the facility down to just a 20 megawatt facility. So part of the site will be dark, or we can keep it big and source energy through the same power plant substation. It's a two-way substation, and we will begin to pull power from the grid. But because we're in these remote locations where most of the renewable energy is located, and that's what's causing the low power, most of the electrons that we're going to be drawing are green. So even though we're drawing from that grid, we're drawing from either that power plant or the power plants that are close by to us to get that extra 30 megawatts. And so that results in a data center that is at least 20% less carbon intensive. And we've done this analysis. You can go download a paper on our website about it, that than a traditional data center. And if you think about that, 18% doesn't seem like a lot, but imagine every single data center reduced their carbon footprint by 18%. That would have a significant effect on the world. In the US alone, I think it would take like a couple of 30 million cars off the road a year, every year.
Google, Microsoft, right? They just announced that the AI demand is actually seeing them have a net increase in their carbon emissions over the last few years when they have very aggressive carbon reduction goals. So it's very clear what they're prioritizing, and you provide an alternative.
Mark my words, it may not seem like much yet, but every enterprise is going to leverage this technology. They have to. They have the data. In fact, there's more data inside of enterprises than OpenAI has used to train ChatGPT and has not been touched by any kind of large language model. So that means that there's going to be distributed computing everywhere that needs to leverage this. That's why these hyperscalers are racing to deploy clouds and computing to support this future demand. The problem is they're still thinking vertically about what data centers look like, where they live. And so they're going to, single point locations where they can build very large campuses, build a big substation, draw as much power from the grid on a 24/7 basis as possible to support this technology. And that increases carbon. It doesn't decrease carbon. It's going to break their ESG. Now, if an enterprise wants to do the same thing and jump into that data center, guess what? Your ESG plans are going to be broken too. Well, there's another option. Think convergence. If you think about the fact that there's lots of wasted green energy electrons that aren't being used for anything right now, except to feed some cows or something like that, turn that into the next great resource for the next great technical revolution. AI, to reach its goal, needs more sustainable power. We have found a way to unlock megawatts, if not gigawatts, of energy that can support that growth in a way that's more sustainable for everyone.
When you had wind farms, everyone was looking for infill solar, I called it, to kind of use the extra real estate to kind of maximize and juice their returns. And then batteries, right, is the next infill technology to do that. But that's all on the supply side of the equation. No one's been thinking of infill demand. And that's exactly what you're doing, is bringing that demand too. Because frankly, the GPUs are agnostic, location agnostic. I mean, as long as you have a fiber line, right, or the appropriate infrastructure. And a lot of that infrastructure is in place because of the monitoring that's required for the renewable energy system.
It's fascinating to me how powerful lateral thinking is. And we're using it here to create a completely different company. We're betting it'll be a legendary one that has reshaped the way we think about renewables and the role of computing in the future.
As a lateral thinker, how do you know if you've gone too far?
The answer to that question is only seen in a rearview mirror. You, as a leader, will learn from your mistakes. And there may be some other effects that we create by moving computing to the places that we're moving it to that we're not thinking about. Maybe there's some kind of unexpected, environmental element that we didn't think about. It's hard to see that right now. But when that mistake happens, what I find is that companies tend to just sort of sweep it under the rug because they're making a lot of money. Bringing it back to culture, we have to be very cognizant of the fact that there will be opportunities for us to tweak the way we do things to ensure that we're continuing to do good and not do things that are bad for the planet. The answer is I don't know until we are experiencing it.
It's a little bit of intuition, right? It's gut.
It is. When you create new business types, you'll get replication. So it scales the opportunity. Everybody makes more money sometimes. But it could create more problems because we can grow at a certain pace, but suddenly you have lots of companies coming in and doing the same thing, and that grows the industry at some, perhaps an accelerated pace. That's when more of the problems happen. But then you have to also take the opportunity to be the first and saying, hey, guys, this thing created a big problem. We need to start fixing that. If you look at social media, that's a perfect example. Go fast and break things or whatever. Well, that they definitely went fast, but now there's a requirement and expectation that something has to be done about it, and people need to be sort of think differently about the technology.
So, what lies ahead for Soluna?
We are focused on a few key things as a company. Number one, we've just launched our Soluna Cloud business. That is a business that's focused on delivering sustainable, scalable AI to enterprises. As I said, we do believe that enterprises will be the primary beneficiaries of this technology. And it's about time they started dipping their toes in to learn about it, start using it within their environments. And we believe that the best way to do that is to start on a platform that thinks about sustainability from day one and can scale with the enterprise right from the onset. By the time this is out there, folks can jump into our enterprise starter package or starter clusters. You can get like a small handful of GPUs and start working on them. That'll allow you to work on some pretty big models, download them, train them, and tune them on your data. And then as you find that there are great applications of that technology in your enterprise, you can then stay with this sustainable platform and scale with us inside these data centers we're building next to renewables. So investing in, focusing on the growth and expansion of Soluna Cloud is going to be extremely important for us. The second thing we're focusing on is continuing to convert our long-term pipeline. We have over 2 gigawatts. So just us alone have been able to accumulate over 2,000 megawatts of power resource that can be applied to the AI space. And so we're going to be focusing on getting those projects to be shovel ready so our investment partners and power plant partners can benefit from the deployment of data centers and ultimately customers at those locations. And we're building a whole host of new partnerships to help us to do that. And then the last thing, which is back to the people, our company started out in one sector in the Bitcoin space. And so we had certain talent and expertise in the company. Now need to bring in new talent in the company that really understand the potential of this technology, have experience selling to the enterprise, understand how to think laterally, love mental models and design thinking. They should be coming over here and helping us to reshape the future. Wherever you're sitting right now listening to this, there's a real opportunity to shape the future of computing and the future of the climate inside of one company. So those are our 3 key areas: grow AI, grow the power footprint, and grow the team.
So, the question I always end with is I ask my guests, and John, I'll ask you, what haven't we covered today that you'd like our listeners to know?
I think the one thing we didn't talk about is the role of the government in the growth and development of this technology. As we've been executing on our business and looking at the future of our company, we're starting to bring in advisors to help us to think through. This is one thing I learned about it at Intel. Think a little further. Like, imagine this technology is wildly successful. It's everywhere. What are some of the new problems, or what does the world look like? What are some of the things that have to happen for that to be true? And it's pretty clear that the government can play a very important role in the future of this technology in the following ways. Number one, implementing regulatory frameworks or incentives to build data centers closer to renewables. That doesn't really exist today. There are certainly tax incentives at a local level or at a state level that drive the development of just general purpose projects that create jobs, et cetera. But I think that they should take a page out of the book, again, thinking laterally or using mental models. Within renewables, there were a host of tax incentives that were created to accelerate the investment in renewables in the country to help to transition away from fossil fuels. That's largely worked. In fact, A lot of those incentives are being replayed and perpetuated in the IRA law. And so, what types of incentives would have to be in place to encourage data center companies to go build their power plants where Soluna is looking to do that would be a great role for the government. The other is infrastructure companies like the ones that build connectivity and get fiber to different parts of the world. They're incentivized by demand, right? So if companies are in a city and they need more connectivity, they get pulled, right? And it's sort of supply demand. There's lots of connectivity that is lacking around the country in these locations that would greatly increase the potential for these types of facilities to exist there. We have to do it, so we have to invest in it. That's very costly. So to the extent that there are grants and government programs that get created to accelerate that or to provide financial support to companies like ours could help to accelerate that. And then I think the third element is creating broad nationwide programs to increase the expertise and training that's going to be needed for a whole new generation of machine learning, data scientists, and expertise that we're going to rely on, that enterprises are going to rely on. There's certainly a role to be played there, and there's sort of a next wave of information economy that is a potential out there. So exploring policy changes at a federal and state level is something that I think should be part of the narrative for this new technology. The other key aspect, Jeff, is companies have already made the shift to, hey, we don't build our own data centers. We don't manage and run them. To go back to that is going to be really hard, but you don't have to jump into the clouds either. It creates a whole new environment for specialized cloud environments where you have reserved capacity and reserved equipment and resources that is safe and protected from anybody else. So you can put your crown jewels in there, your data, to do that training and get the leverage from it. And that, I think, is the future of how this technology will be based, because it's the way they use this will be so fundamental to their business.
So before we go, just one last piece of advice for any aspiring entrepreneurs.
Don't do it. No, just that's it's harder than you think, but it's the most transformational journey that you will ever go on. Entrepreneurship is really a journey that an individual goes on to find their own growth pathways. In my 20 plus year history, what I have learned about myself is more valuable than the skills and experiences and the financial security that I've gained by building companies. It's actually learning how good I am in doing some things, how not good I am in doing other things, what things that I can leverage from others. Am I a leader? How do I become a leader? How do you drive change? How do you convince people to do something that is right, but they don't yet understand? That is a journey more about you than about the person on the other side. And the companies that find themselves stagnating, it's when the leader who is running the ship, if you will, hasn't made the step change shift to align with the stage of the company. See, entrepreneurs, they sort of believe that once they start building a company, it just goes up and to the right. They believe the slides that they that they present to the the VCs and everything. But the reality of it doesn't look like that. It goes up, then it goes down. It kind of spirals out of control for a little bit, and then you sort of get it back into the right pathway, and then it steps back up again and keeps going. Each time that shift happens, the leader, what they should be doing, the role they're playing in the company, and the leadership as well changes. And there's growth that has to happen in that leadership at a fundamentally individual level, but also as a team. The leader of the company is responsible for recognizing that and making sure that that growth and shifting is happening. If you can think through, so we talk about frameworks, putting your company in that kind of framework environment and measuring where you are along that pathway, and just realizing that, hey, the reason I'm feeling uncomfortable is because it's time to shift. I have to go out and get some new training, bring in some new advice to mentorship to sort of help me to go through that growth. such that I'm aligned with the capabilities the company needs at any given time. That's why I like to say that, building companies is like climbing a mountain. It gets harder and harder as you reach the top. And then when you finally reach the top, you realize the mountain you were actually climbing, it's you. You are the mountain. It's not like this external thing. It's like a thing on the inside of you that is really the challenge and the opportunity. And that's why I love it so much. Every company that I build, I learn more about myself and grow more as a leader and as a person.
Thank you for taking the time to be with us and share your journey and just share all of your really unique insights. And the mental model of inversion is one that I know many of our listeners will take away, but also the encouragement to take that entrepreneurial leap because it's the personal journey that will be the most fulfilling. And so that and other bits of wisdom, I just want to thank you.
Thanks, Jeff, for having me on the show. And it was a pleasure. Great questions, great insight, always.
Thanks, John.